Hi and welcome to this DCP web tutorial. In today's tutorial I'm going to be showing you how to create a new hosting account using WHM11 Web Hosting Manager. So when we create these hosting accounts, they're typically called Cpanel accounts, and the type of hosting that you purchase will determine whether you have WHM or not. Typically WHM, Windows Host Manager and Cpanel accounts are created or these services are provided when you register or create a hosting service using Linux based servers. So I want to go through some few basic steps that you need to do before you can go ahead and actually register a WHM11 hosting management service, and then how to create those Cpanel accounts. So the first thing is I'm going to load up my Firefox. I've got a few tabs here already preloaded, and I'm taking you to this particular website called Enom. And before you create your hosting account and your WHM management service, you need to register a domain. So you may already have a domain registered, and that's great, but if you don't, you can use something like Enom, which is what I use, or you can use 123reg, and there's plenty of other domain registration providers, but you should really try and register the domain before you go and set up the hosting management service. So these two domain providers also provide hosting services as well, but there's other hosting providers out there. I just want to show you a couple of examples. There's GoDaddy, and there's also one that I normally use. It's called Site5. And with Site5, they have various types of hosting services provided, and the ones that typically have WHM control management is the reseller, the cloud hosting, and the virtual servers here as well. So in this reseller example, you can see when you purchase the reseller, you get certain amounts of disk space and bandwidth, and you get something here called Cpanel and WHM. This is quite important. This is what this tutorial is based on. So typically I would register the domain name first, and when I order this particular product from Site5, it's going to ask me for a default domain name, and that's typically the domain name that's used to control the WHM. It can be also a domain that you use to run a website, but typically I separate the domains that I use to run a website away from WHM. So I use a specific domain to manage WHM, and then register other ones to run actual websites using the Cpanel. So once you've got your domain registered, whether it's with Enom, 123reg, or whichever domain provider you use, I typically use these two because the features they have inside are quite easy to understand and they're quite robust, and you need to do a few things with the domain name before all of this actual WHM service can be available. So typically when I set up a reseller account with Site5 or with other type of service providers, they're going to send you an email with information about WHM and Cpanel, various information about these particular services, and what's quite important is when they send you that particular email, they're going to send you something called name servers, and it's always going to be two name servers, and they're going to send you default name servers and also the ability to create private name servers. So in an example, here I've got a domain name that I registered. It's called HTML5 banner ad designers. I registered this quite a while ago, and in my Enom account I was able to create private name servers here, ns1 collective51.com and .ns2. So there was name server 1 and name server 2. So when you get the email from your provider, your hosting provider, they will send you these name servers. So you can either create private name servers or you can use the default name servers. There's not much difference between the two, to be honest. It all does the same thing. I just like to use these private name servers, but if you want to use private name servers, you have to configure them in your Enom, your 123reg, or wherever else you've registered the domain. So first point of call is register the domain, and then you need to point the name servers or create the private name servers. Okay, I hope that all makes sense. So now I'm going to go over to this tab here, and this is where I've got my actual WHM running from here. So when I created this reseller account on, or when I registered this reseller account on site 5, it asked me for a domain name that's going to be used to control all of the website accounts that I create, which are called Cpanel accounts. And the WHM domain that I used was called collective-51.com, and that is registered with an email service provider, a domain provider, and I created a private name server there located with the domain registrar. So once you've got all of that set up, you'll be able to access your WHM control panel, and in here you can see loads of different options. It may look quite complicated, but I'm going to go through just the basic elements of what you need to do. If you click on this list accounts, it's going to list all of the different web hosting accounts that you have already, but let's assume that we don't have any at the moment. And the first thing that you should really do is actually create packages. If you don't do these, then every package you create is just going to be a bit random, and I'll explain what a package is. Let's edit, because I've created a few examples already. So I'm going to click on this edit a package, and in here I've got collective 1 250 and collective 1 500. So the 250 represents 250 megabytes of disk space and bandwidth, and 500 equals 500 megabytes of disk space and bandwidth. Because when you create this reseller account, you get a certain amount of disk space and a certain amount of bandwidth, and you can create many accounts, but you can't exceed these limits, which is quite important to understand. So if you go and create Cpanel accounts that have got very large amounts of disk space and bandwidth, then you're going to be able to create fewer amounts in there. It's going to, throw some errors saying you've used up all your disk space or your bandwidth. So you have to be a bit careful how you set up these packages. Now most websites are going to use very little bandwidth and disk space. Depends on how popular they are and what you're doing. If you're running an e-commerce store, then you're going to need much bigger bandwidth and disk space. So you can create some of these at different levels, and you need to try and preempt or determine how much each one of your hosting or your domains or your websites, how much disk space and bandwidth they're going to use. So in this example, I just want to add a new one. I'm not going to edit this, I'm going to add a new one, and I need to give this a name. And in this example, I'm going to call it, I've got a 250, I've got a 500, so I'm going to call it collective 1 _ 1000. And the disk space quota, you can either leave it unlimited, which is not always the wisest thing to do. You can put the quota, in this example I'm going to put it to 1000. The monthly bandwidth, typically I set it to, if it's 1000 megabytes, then I set it to 10,000 bandwidth. If it's 250 megabytes, then I set it to 2500 bandwidth. That's just my own preference. You can do what you want. With the FTP accounts, I always set this to 1. You shouldn't really need more than one FTP account. The number of emails are set to 10. You shouldn't really need more than 10 emails. You might need to. The lists are set to 10. The databases are set to 2. And the subdomains are set to 10. Part domains 10. And maximum add-on domains are set to 10. So you can go and do a bit of research and try and understand what each one of these elements is. But typically these are these setting, all of these ones here, this is typically what I do. And it's just the disk space and the monthly bandwidth. That's what I vary on each package that I create, and you'll understand why I'm creating these packages in a minute. So there's a few other options down here, and typically I leave these as default, and I always set the cPanel theme to X3. This is the most intuitive interface. There's loads of other interfaces here, but just leave it as default X3. If it's not already selected like that, you should try and select this option. And everything else, if you want to change the local language, if you prefer to use a different language, then you can do that here. But typically I'm going to leave it as default English, and I don't need a dedicated IP. I don't need shell access and these other things, and we can request shell access later if we need it. So all of this stuff is really done as default, and I'm going to click the add button. And when I go to edit packages now, I'm going to see I've got 3 different ones here. And there's a reason for that, and I'll explain that as we go along. So with this demonstration, what I want to do is create a new account. But before I create a new account, I need to register a domain name. So I've registered one domain that's going to control, it's called Collective51. This controls all of this WHM. It can be a website in its own right, but typically I separate those away. So I use one domain to control WHM, and then I use many other domains to actually run websites. So in this example, I registered a second domain, and this domain is called HTML5 Banner Ad Designers. And this is where I'm going to be running a website project, and I've set up the name servers here. And if you don't set up private name servers, or if you find that too difficult, then you can use the default name servers as well, and I'm going to show you what those will be in a second. But first of all, I just need to copy this domain name here. I'm going to copy this because I'm going to need this domain, and I'm going to go back to WHM, and I'm going to create a new account. I'm going to click on create a new account. And when I get into this domain, I'm going to paste it into here, and it's going to create a username. Now typically I always change this username. I don't use the default username. I change it slightly, so I'll put a random number. I'll delete one of the characters, so really it's using like the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. It's using like the first 8 characters of the domain. I'll delete the last letter and I replace it with a random number or another random letter, and I keep a note of that as well somewhere. So I've got the domain in here and the username in here, and then you should really use this password generator, and it's going to create these random passwords. You can, if you don't think it's too secure, then you can create these random passwords. You should keep a note of these somewhere, secure note somewhere, maybe on a USB stick or somewhere secure on an offline machine, just so that you've got access to these passwords. You're going to need them later. So I'm going to put in a password. I've already got one prepared. And in here, you need to put in a valid email address. So, I'm just going to put in, because this is just a demo, I'm just going to put in test@test.com. But really, you should put a proper email address in, and that needs to be one that's already active. So something like your Hotmail, your Yahoo, or if you've got another email address, a typical business email address that you use, it's worth putting it in here. It's quite important. And the reason why you need to put an email address in here is if this website is running out of disk space or running out of bandwidth, it's going to send you an email before it runs out to notify you. So you can upgrade or downgrade. Typically, you would always upgrade your email accounts, your disk space and your bandwidth when these warnings come through. I call them warnings, but really, it's just for your own information. You're running out of disk space, you're running out of bandwidth, so it's telling you that you need to do something. So here you've got choose a package, and remember, there's some default ones here called diamond, gold, silver. These ones are like set up by Cpanel as default, but diamond, gold, silver, special, and super don't mean anything to me. So typically, I create my own ones here. So I know that this one's got 1,000 disk space and 10,000 bandwidth. This has got 250 disk space, 2,500 megabytes bandwidth, 500 and 5,000 megabytes bandwidth. So this clearly tells me I understand what they are. So I'm going to set this to just to 250 because I know it's not going to use a lot of disk space or bandwidth. And if I need to upgrade it, I can always come in and change the package or do some manual edits to it to change the bandwidth. And the local settings, I'm going to leave them as English. You can change these if you want to, but in this package I'm going to leave them as default English. And what's quite important here is I'm going to enable this option here as well. I'm going to enable both of these. Now, if you remember, when I registered the domain, I set it to private name servers here. So if you have any difficulty setting up those private name servers, you shouldn't really. I mean, if you go to Google and you type in, let's say if you register it at 123reg, and you type in 123reg, let's say setup private name servers, there's going to be how to add private name servers to a domain name. So if you're having difficulty setting up your private name servers wherever you registered them, then just follow the instructions, type it into Google, and they'll tell you exactly how to do that. And when you created the actual reseller account or this environment, you would have received an email or some notification of what those private name servers were and the related IP addresses. So there's no reason why you shouldn't be able to set up private name servers. But if you just don't want to, then as default, when you receive that email, you'll also get these default name servers as well. So these are just default name servers. But the domain must be pointed to at least the default name servers or the private name servers, the one that you're going to create a hosting account for, like this example here. So the other option here is to choose how the emails for this domain that you're going to create an account for. So if I created info at html5 if I wanted to now create an email account, I need to decide how those emails are going to work. So I typically never use this automatic detection. It's either going to be a local mail exchange. It's I typically never use like a backup mail exchange server or remote mail exchange server. But if you're using some third-party configuration, or if you've got your email services provided by a different provider, then you might need to select this remote mail exchange server. Typically, you should discuss that with your techie guys in your office, or your web development company, or your web developer, or even the hosting provider might be able to provide you with information about this. But if you set it to local mail exchange, then you'll be able to create your own email accounts using Cpanel. So I'm going to show you that in a moment. So what's quite important is you've got the domain name, the username, and the password. And those three elements you're going to need when you when you log into your Cpanel account. So this is just creating the Cpanel at the moment. So I'm going to click this create account, and it's going to go through a few processes. And this takes a few seconds to do this, so we just wait for this to happen. It's not the quickest job, but you have to be a bit patient here. Yeah, it's not okay. Here we go. It's just doing this now. Now all this stuff that WHM is doing right here is creating really what we call a Cpanel account for this HTML5 banner ad designers.co.uk. So I can actually go ahead now and upload my files and run a website from this domain. And it's doing all of this stuff. There's many ways to do this configuration. You can do it manually via Linux, but it's very, you need to understand Linux coding and all the commands. So it's doing a lot of this job for us. It's creating all the DNS configuration, and it's doing a lot of the work, a lot of the heavy lifting for you. So this is why we typically use WHM. It makes complex processes very easy, although it's not the quickest at doing this. If you had your own dedicated server, then this job will happen much quicker, but we just have to be a bit patient here. It will set up all the databases as well, so if you want to create a website which is using a database, then it will give you the ability to create those databases and so forth. So this is almost done now, and here it is. It's going to give me all the default information about this particular WHM control panel, but all of this you don't really need to understand. This it's just the information there. But the two things that you're going to need to know, and I'm going to change this password in a minute, but you're going to need the password, you're going to need the domain name, and you're going to need the HTML or this username. So you're going to need these three elements: the domain, the username, and the password, and that's going to allow you to access the Cpanel. So I'll change this password in a minute. So let's just go and have a look at accessing Cpanel. So here I'm going to get rid of this domain tools extension, and I'm just going to go straight to HTML5 designers, and you're going to see this like default CGI page, this Cpanel page. Now one thing to note, when I type in this HTML5 banner ad designers, when you pointed the private name servers or the name servers, this page may not show straight away. I did that job. I pointed these name servers. Let's just go back quickly. I did this job quite a while ago. I did it a few days ago, and this takes some time to propagate. So when you do this using your domain provider, it will say on there this may take 24 to 48 hours to fully propagate these name servers. But typically it takes a lot less than that. It depends on the domain provider. This is why I typically use one of these two providers, because these name server updates and updates to the domains typically happen a lot faster. So it's up to you, but you need to wait a little bit of time. And if you've done all of this configuration here, and for some reason you don't see some sort of default page here, then the reason behind this is you need to wait a little bit longer for all of that to get configured and set up. So let's try and access the cPanel. I'm not sure if it works straight away. It should do, really. So now it's asking me for the username and password. So I can put in the username and password now. And now I can access the cPanel account that I've created. So just a quick overview. Number one, we registered a default domain name for the WHM control panel using some type of domain provider. So either enorm, 123reg, or there's plenty of other ones out there. I typically use these two because the configuration, the control panels for these are quite intuitive, and the documentation on how to do things, like set up private name servers, you can find all that information on via Google or via their help. So this is why I use these services, but you can use whatever you want. It's entirely your choice. So we create a default domain name for the WHM. We then go to somewhere like Site5 or GoDaddy, and we create a reseller account. So this service is going to give us access to the WHM. And when I create that, I use that domain name that I've registered here as a part of the sign up process. So after I've done that, Site5 or GoDaddy will send you an email with information about your WHM access. It's going to give you the URL or how you access your WHM. In my case, I use collective51.com/WHM. But you may need, depending on what domain you registered, it will be a different domain, but it will always be WHM at the end, /WHM. Once you've pointed the name servers, or you've configured your private name servers for your control panel for your WHM, then you can access that WHM, or you can access it via the IP address as well. But you should really go and point the name servers correctly. So either use the private name servers in the email or the default name servers, one of the two. Once you've done that, you'll be able to access your WHM using collective51.com/WHM, and then you're going to see this default homepage here. And then you should really then go and create your packages. That's the first thing you want to do. Create these packages like we showed you before. Once you've done that, then you can go ahead and create an account and keep note of all the information, the login details that you create. That's quite important. Once you've done that, you can create your account. Before you create that account, really you need to register a domain name again for that particular website that you're going to be running. So this one was called HTML5 Banner Ad Designers. So you register that domain, and then you point the name servers again one more time, and then you'll be able to go ahead and create the account here. So that might seem a bit complicated, but that's the way it works. It's it's a little bit tricky to understand, but if you follow those steps that I've given you, you shouldn't have too much of a problem. Just have to be patient. When you create these accounts, it may not happen straight away. You may not see the cPanel straight away. It's because it takes a bit of time for the name servers to propagate. So you've got to remember that it's going to take a little bit of time when you point those name servers to fully propagate, and then you'll be able to access this cPanel account. And from here, then you can go and create email accounts, you can create FTP accounts, and you can start transferring your website using the FTP service to get your website up and running. So I hope you understood that tutorial, and I'm going to be uploading this video to YouTube. So if you're watching it via YouTube or one of my social networks on dcpweb.co.uk, if you're checking it from one of my social networks or YouTube, and if you've got any problems or you're not too sure about some of the steps, feel free to ask a question on one of those social networks or YouTube, and I'll gladly try and reply and help you along the way. I hope you enjoyed this tutorial, and I look forward to seeing you on the next DCP Web tutorial.